I'll get it, bro. Like they're way more punk rock than Blink, than Green Day, as far as like just sound, sonically speaking. This is a band that I think often gets overlooked in talks about pop punk, punk rock, just in general. The Offspring doesn't really get brought up a lot. And I thought I knew why. I really did, man. And then I started listening to these songs and I was like, I'll get it, bro. Like they're way more punk rock than Blink, than Green Day, as far as like just sound, sonically speaking. And yeah, I feel like they get sold short because of how they chose to have some silly stuff going on in some of their songs. Pretty Fly for a White Guy, stuff like that. Like, while I get it, it is kind of silly. And I think that's the reason they get kind of forgotten, lost in the shuffle, I guess. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, and like I've told you before, the first big video I ever made was titled "The Offspring Get No Respect," and it was kind of based off of this exact thesis. Which, looking back, is like kind of got it from Ian Winwood's book Smash, because there's like a whole chapter about it, and he kind of has that same theory of it. And I think you said it, because after going through their catalog again, I kind of maintain my beliefs and why they don't get that sort of respect. It's very unique to them, I think, is what it is. I think a lot of this other analysis we can kind of say like, this doesn't happen because this, and this. With the Offspring, it's very like specific as to why they are not they're not cool enough to be like with the Rancids and NoFXs, but they're also not like hip enough to be how like Blink and Green Day are still kind of some of the biggest bands in the world. It's a very weird spot that they occupy within like punk, pop culture, and like just rock music in general. They're kind of a one of one in that.
I absolutely agree. I think that they're so smart, because those guys, that band as a whole, are very intelligent people, that they saw a way to capitalize on, grab people's attention, and then when you dig below the surface and you get into our songs on like the deep cuts and the B-sides, you get real thick slices of content of and what's the word I'm looking for here, man? There's a word I'm looking for. Commentary on like on the world at large. You get a lot of that in their music, dude. Like they got, we're going to talk about their songs, bro. They got some dark music. And I think that they were looking at their options and they were like, well, we got to set ourselves apart so that we get noticed, because they were in the mix with the Green Days, the Blinks, the Rancids. So how do you do that? Well, you make a song that's so catchy and silly that it's on the radio all the time, and then people buy the album and they listen to the album, and then people like us that buy the album dig below the surface, and we're fortunate enough to have that kind of, I don't know, desire, I guess, what it would be. We have the desire to go and listen to an entire record and get, like, most of my songs, I'd say, like, I got on my list of top 10, it's like 23 songs long. I'd say most of them are going to be either singles that were like the third or fourth single, or they're like B-sides. Like they're people are going to be really surprised by my list. I think there's a couple that are going to be okay, yeah, of course, but overall I think I've got deeper cuts than just the popular songs. But I think the band definitely still doesn't get any respect. I think that, and I've got a personal beef with them with how they treated Pete Parada. So, but that set aside, that's just a personal thing. I still look at it as like okay, well, how do they get treated in the world of punk rock? They don't get mentioned. People don't consider them a punk band. But listening to this, they are. Like they're a punk rock band still. It's weird. They're not even really pop punk, and any more than you could say a band like Pennywise would be pop punk, in my opinion.
So there's a lot to that, and that's kind of like the basis of everything I have to really say tonight. That's sort of like the Cliff Notes version, which is kind of funny because we didn't really discuss it, but it is a lot of that. A lot of it is
very coincidental.
In how they present their pop music it has a big part of how they are perceived by everybody as a result of that, because their bass music, like the deep cuts, as you're saying, and I have a lot of those like as my sort of favorites, like the third single, the fourth. It's usually not the single that was the big single, but it was the single that probably got the guys that were a little more inclined to think like you and I do to sort of get them in. And so that's even my relationship with the Offspring is not really as a punk band. Like I kind of have the take on them I did when I was younger that you have on a lot of these bands that I consider pop punk, but you say are kind of a different genre of music. That's sort of how I always interacted with the Offspring, because like, unlike the Blinks and the Green Days and those bands, you know, all the small things and Welcome to Paradise and all that, maybe there's some of the popular hits on those records. So as we talked about last week, they're chosen for the radio singles. They're not so drastically different as Pretty Fly for a White Guy is from like Pay the Man or something like that on the same exact record. It is such a left turn. And quite frankly, what it gets down to is there's certain datedness to their songs that got really big. So they, more than a lot of other bands, feel like a time warp, and they're the one band that doesn't really have the songs to catch in on that kind of cushy nostalgia the way a Blink and a Green Day have these sort of heartthrob songs that will always have that kind of Bryan Adams type of appeal to them. Whereas the Offspring at their core are Pennywise. Like, they are very much a sister band with like Pennywise. So their pop music though is something that Pennywise, like that's the difference, is like Pennywise doesn't have like a Pretty Fly for a White Guy or an Original Prankster. I mostly agree with that, with the exception of the heartthrob songs. They've got some songs that are just as important to me, and I hear them. And since I was around when this stuff dropped, it also dropped at the same time as the Green Day stuff. So to me, it sends me right back, just like Green Day does. But some of their biggest songs are those wacky, kooky songs that will not get them the same respect. So I guess we're probably saying very much the same thing, but I think I'm a little less where you're at, but I'm mostly there. I'm mostly where you're at on that. I think it's the difference too, and that's one of the things we have this time difference between you and I at times, because whereas maybe like the Blink, which I always say like I got Blink a little more first run, that has that effect on me of like even those big songs are still kind of pop songs to me, and related and part of it and part of that time period. Where the Offspring, quite frankly, I categorize them way more with like the Sublimes and the 311s and those guys, like in my head.
Oh, really?
That's to me
interesting.
Like that's where they sort of reside with a much bigger punk rock base though than when we say it's like Sublime and Pennywise, that's kind of right around. You can see where it is. Whereas like again, Sublime went in a different direction, but I think again that's where I would more put. Like I think of people who used to listen to the Offspring when I was a kid. It was not the people that eventually got me into like Rancid and that kind of stuff. It was the ones again. It was like the dudes that would have been into the new metal and into the 311 and into all that. Americana and Smash were just another CD that those guys had. So where I heard a lot of these songs for the first time, to be honest with you.
So I think that's probably just a situation based on where you're from, because I don't have that same experience. And the guys that I did get the Offspring from, they were on Epitaph, dude. It was the same guys that listened to Pennywise. Now, it wasn't the guys that listened to something I'm about to bring up here in a minute. It wasn't the dudes that listened to the Casualties, but it was the guys that listened to like Pennywise. They just stopped listening to them when they started, I think probably Conspiracy of One is where they probably stopped listening to them. They got all up to Americana, and then they were like, all right, I'm out. I no longer care about this band. But I am a little older, so I did discover them with the punk bands, because they were on Nitro Records, they were on Epitaph, so they were on these labels with these bands that were extremely important to me. AFI, Rancid, like what? The Offspring very much ride with those guys.